Welcome to this programming user interface lecture. Today we're going to talk about JavaScript. The basics kind of we're going to get started today with is a kind of an introduction to JavaScript and go from there. So JavaScript is a programming language. It was designed to run in web browsers originally, and that was way back in 1995, and it's been around ever since, and it's been kind of evolving and developing. Um, but pretty much it exists because if you think about the way HTTP and HTML web pages work, is that they're static documents, right, being sent from the server. And so you can have a lot of elaborate activity on the back end, deciding how to generate that HTML file and send it to the browser. But once it's in the browser, it's pretty static. And so what JavaScript has done is added ability to do more dynamic things and make the HTML standard from a purely kind of document standard to now more of like an interface standard. And so you can use JavaScript to do all these more complicated interactions and things with CSS and HTML. So it's historically been used to kind of enhance a website's functionality, right? Gradually enhance it. So, depending on what you want the website to do, you'd have JavaScript, or maybe you wouldn't even include JavaScript at all on your site. And the way you get it into your HTML page is similar to the CSS, right? So you can use a script tag to actually write JavaScript right into your HTML code. So you can use a script element, or you can include it as an external JavaScript file, a JS file. Similarly, how you can include a external CSS file. So if you think about the areas of JavaScript use and why you would use it, you can kind of think of it in like a progressively more JavaScript based heavy kind of step system or tiers, right? So if you just want to do some basic UI enhancements and kind of user experience kind of stuff, you can just use some basic JavaScript to control things like showing elements, hiding things, changing styles, validating forms, all that stuff. Next level up would be kind of like loading content. So you can load external content as data and populate it into your page, right? So this doesn't require you to refresh a page, right? You can use this APIs or something like that to load in data from the server and then rebuild the page or add additional content to the page without having to refresh the browser. Then you get into much more advanced kind of widgets type things, right? Like, so you have like a map widget, you can browse maps in the browser. More complicated visualizations, D3 and stuff like that, data visualizations, etc. And then you kind of at the end of the scale, you have these basically entire websites made out of JavaScript. And so this is becoming a pretty common way of developing websites using React or Vue or something like that. And it's a way to basically use JavaScript, and the JavaScript library generates the entire HTML page for you in the client, in the browser in real time. So these are kind of like different steps of thinking about how you'd want to use JavaScript, and depending on your situation and what you want the page to do, one of these levels of using JavaScript would be appropriate. So today we're going to talk a little bit about just kind of like using JavaScript to do some UI or HTML, CSS enhancements. And so the first thing to kind of understand about that is that everything on a web page, the HTML page, is basically stored in a hierarchical document. And so everything has a parent, and there's a parent that is the parent of everything on the page, and things become nested and et cetera, right? Because it's HTML, so everything's very nested. And so the way that the JavaScript deals with this is that it generates what's called a document object model for the page. So every element on the page can be represented in JavaScript in this DOM model. And so you can access every piece of every element and all attributes of that element, things like style element or the class or the ID or any sorts of attribute for the element through this DOM model, this document object model. And so you can do all sorts of things with this DOM model. So you can create and remove elements, add new elements, remove old elements. You can toggle stuff, change the CSS, add new classes, remove classes. You can do stuff like form validation, right? So instead of sending a value to the server, you could check it for consistency to what you want the person to submit in their form. And other things that if you think about what a pure CSS HTML page can do, you would want to have JavaScript to do those things, right? So any sort of dynamic things, any sort of interactive things, you'd want to use JavaScript for. So here's a little link to just kind of like a reintroduction to JavaScript if you maybe use it a little bit or you're pretty new to it. This is a good kind of tutorial around it. But the main thing that we're going to be looking at today is how do we use this DOM model? How do we access these elements on the page and do different stuff with them? And this is kind of like the foundation for deciding, how you would approach a certain problem, like interface problem, right? So you wanted to do something very specific on your page. You'd have to think about, well, how do I access that piece of HTML, and then what do I want to do with it? So these first three items on the list, document get element by ID, by tag, and create element. So these are basically static things that you're using to either locate an element on the page that already exists, right? So if you have a div on the page already and it has a certain ID assigned to it, you can get that element by its ID and then do something with it, right? Or you could get a certain tag elements by IDs and return an array of all of them. And then the third one is you can actually create a new element, right, in memory and create it and do something with it, right? So these first three things are kind of like either locating something that exists on the page already or creating it to be used. And so once you get past that point, you're basically working with one of those things. You're either working with something that you located on the page and you have a reference to it, or you're working with something that you created in memory, a new element in memory, and you're going to do something with it. And so you can do all sorts of stuff with these things. Once you've either located it or created it, you can add it to a parent, right? So everything in HTML is a hierarchy, so everything has a parent. You can change the inner HTML of it, so that means like change basically the HTML that's inside that element. You can change different style attributes, right? So any style attribute you can think about if you do inline styling, like style equals border color left equals blue, right? Or colon blue. You can do that with element.style, and then the next piece of it is the CSS property name. You can set attributes, get attributes, right? So if you wanted to change the href of a link, for example, that would be a set attribute. If you wanted to get the current attribute or something, you could get the get attribute. And then you can also work with the elements class list, right? So it has all these classes associated with it. If you added a class and you put space and you add in more classes, this is basically an array of classes, right? And you can do things like add more classes to it, remove classes from it, toggle classes on and off. And then this final thing that we'll talk more about is adding an event listener, right? So web pages are documents, and then when the user interacts with them, it's an event. And so everything has an event. Clicking has an event, using the keyboard has an event. All these sorts of things have events based to it. So there's a link there to kind of review those, the DOM model. And so what I would want to do is we're going to kind of go through each one of these and just get a sense of what they do and how to interact with them, starting with like locating an element and then manipulating it somehow. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new static glitch site just to kind of do a demo for some of these things. So I'm going to make a new, blank static hello world site. And again, so the key things we need to do is get the JavaScript in the page somehow, and then locate an element, and then do something with that element, or create that element and do something with it. All right, so we have our HTML page here. So we can take a look at it, right? This is just a very basic static glitch site. All right, so what we want to do is start thinking about where does this JavaScript actually live and how do we get it into the page, right? And so, of course, this is also important to think about how the document interacts with the JavaScript and how the JavaScript interacts with the document. So, for example, you can see that they already, in a basic glitch site, they're already including this external JavaScript file, which is in the, it's right here. But we can also do this where you include the script in the header, right? And so what you need to know about where you put the script tag is very important. So if you put the script tag in the header of the page, it's going to run first. And basically, it's going to run before the browser renders any of the page. So if you put script tags in here and you start talking about elements that are supposed to be in the page and referencing them, they're actually not going to be in existence by the time the script runs, right? So if this script was running before the web browser renders any of the page, then those elements haven't been rendered, and the script is not going to know what you're talking about if you're referencing stuff. So there's a lot of ways, of fancy ways of getting around this. You're basically waiting for the document to say, okay, I'm done rendering the page and it's ready to go. That we'll talk about later. But for now, if we can get around this by just putting our script tag at the bottom of the page. And so here's the glitch button. We'll ignore that for now. But if we put our script tag at the bottom of the page, then by the time it gets to the script tag, it's in the body, it's fine. It will have done all of this rendering of the other elements in the page by the time it gets to the bottom of it, right? So by the time it gets to the bottom of the script tag and it runs its things, this p tag already exists. So if I reference that p tag in my script, then it's fine, right? It exists and it knows how to interact with it. Likewise, if you put the script above the elements you're talking about, you probably would run into some problems depending on the timing of the rendering and stuff like that. Because there's kind of like lots of things happening at once, kind of asynchronously, right? So it's like rendering the page, it's running the JavaScript, et cetera, all at once. So you might be okay, but for us, we're just going to kind of put it at the bottom of the page here. All right, so the first thing that we wanted to play around with was this get element stuff. So you can get element by a number of things, by a number of queries. You can get elements by its ID, which is probably the simplest. You can get elements by the class name. You can get elements by its tag name. And then you can even query, come up with your own queries to search for very specific elements based on your query. But to get started, let's just think of this basic element of get element by ID. So if we have our code here, right, and let's make a div. We're going to give this div an ID, and we'll call it test div. So this div has an ID, and so what we can now do is basically use that document.getElement by ID to get a pointer to that specific element, right? And this is basically kind of like the workflow that we're going to be using when we use document get element by ID, right? So we're basically going to be creating a pointer to something, so creating a pointer to an existing element that we want to modify. And then once we have that pointer, we can change it, right? And so this is, if you've done programming before, this pointer is called a variable. And so basically you're storing a pointer to this element in a variable, and then that variable has things built into it that you can change the element. It's kind of like a reference to the element on the page, right? So if we want to get a pointer to this div, we need to somehow reference it, right? And so the way we can reference it is by using this built-in document. In this case, the document represents the whole document in the browser, so like the entire document. Everything that's involved with the web page is stored in this constant thing called the document. It always exists there. So you can say document dot get element by ID, and then inside of here in a string, so there's like double quotes, you put the name of the ID you'd want, right? So this is the name of our ID we want. So basically we're copying this whole thing and saying get this element here. And so this would work, right? And this would return kind of a pointer to that div that exists on the page. But the thing we need to do now is store the reference somewhere so we can do something with it with the next step, right? And I'll show you why we'd want to do that versus not doing that. But in this case, we are going to do it. So to store a variable, we call them variables, you say var, and then you have to come up with a variable name. So anything that you would want to come up with is a good variable name. You probably want to name it something that is useful to you so you remember what it is, right? Because if you call everything X or Y, then it's very confusing. What does X or Y mean? But in our case, we're storing this as a test div, so we'll just call it test div. That's fine with us, right? And so we have this equal sign. So we're saying var test div equals the result of this operation. And this operation is looking for that element with that ID and then returning it and storing it in this test div variable, right? This can be whatever we want, this name here. It doesn't have to be the name of the element. It could be we'll call it my div instead, right? So we have this variable now, this reference or pointer to the actual elements. And one thing that we'll often do when you're doing JavaScript is doing console log. And so the console is if when you're in a web page and you do inspect, we've done this many times before, right? And we usually inspect like elements here, right? So we're looking at kind of like just basic elements of the web page. But there's also a tab here for the network stuff. We've done that, a little bit of that, looking at network responses, and then there's also the console. And so the console is a way to access what's going on in the JavaScript of the page, right? And so using the console, you can get very valuable like kind of feedback or work more with the JavaScript that's going on behind the scenes. And so to get something to print out to this console, you simply say console, right? And so console is always going to be there. It's another constant. It's like document. And you can say log. And then inside these parentheses, you say what you want to log. So we'll say hello there, right? And if we ran that again, we'd see our hello there, right? And then there would be a link to where that happens in your JavaScript, right? So we have this other thing that says hi here, and that's happening in our JavaScript file that's been included by glitch by default. So we could actually go back and let's get rid of that. Let's delete everything in this JavaScript file for now. All right, so back to our code, right? So hello there, it's working. And so you can console log anything you want, and it's going to try to turn it into a display in that log. And so what we could do is we could try to console log the result of this operation, right? The result of the get element by ID, and see what happens. So here's the console log, and it actually returns results, right? It returns the pointer of that get element by ID. And you can kind of see in the page above, it's like pointing out in the screen where that exists, right? So I can add some content there. And if we look again, it's console logging that, and then you can see that's the div, right? So this variable represents that actual element that's in the web page right now, right? And so now that we have a reference to this element, we can do all sorts of stuff to it, right? And so the rest of that list is kind of the things you can do to the element once you have it selected. So you can set the inner HTML of the element. Let's try that. And so the inner HTML is just basically the what's inside the element, right? So it could be text, like right now it's hello there. And so we could try this. Let's try to log it, inner HTML. So let's see what happens. So it logs what's inside the element. And then we can also, instead of logging it, right, let's comment this out, we could set it instead. We can say it's set to yes. So when it loads, it's set to yes, right? And so you can kind of think about this, the flow of the document. When the document's loaded and rendered, this is the text that's in there. But once it gets to the script is changing the document and it changes the value. And so if you were quick enough, you could see it switching from hello there to yes, right? But since it's like such a simple change and the browser's so fast, it's almost like instantaneous. You don't even see it changing. All right, so that's one way of doing it. And you should also note that you can actually add HTML, proper HTML in this inner HTML. So if you wanted to add, say, I wanted to add a link inside of here, you could actually put HTML in here and not put a string, right? So you could say a href equals pratt.edu, and I have Pratt. So this is actually not using just text to replace the inner HTML. It's replacing the inner HTML with more HTML. So let's see if it works, right? And it actually put a link there, and I didn't put HTTP, so it thinks it's like it thinks it's a relative link. Right, and I spelled this wrong, but you get the idea. So, so you can actually put real HTML in this inner HTML, and it will render it as real HTML. And it's good to do simple stuff like this, but if you're going to be doing much more elaborate HTML structures, you don't want to really think about it as doing it this way, right? Because then you're basically trying to build really big strings of HTML and change stuff inside of a big string. It's really difficult, and make sure all the elements are closed and etc. So if you're going to be building much bigger structures, you probably don't want to use this approach, but it's very good for like very simple stuff like this. So that's inner HTML. The next one we'll look at is the style, right? And so the style is the, let's change this back to hello. So the style is basically the CSS inline style, right? So when we're doing this in HTML, you'd say style equals, and you could say something like background. Color is tomato, right? Tomato. And of course that would make it that color, right? And so what we can do with JavaScript is we have access to the style kind of tree, the styled elements, and we can change them from once we have a pointer to that element. We don't have to use this style. You can change the style based on JavaScript and not have it in the actual element itself, style attribute. So you would just, again, we have the pointer to my div, so we say my div.style, and now this style object has all the CSS styles built into it, right? So things like color is there, right? So we could say color is tomato. Right, and so it's saying that style color. And then you can change any of the CSS styles to it. The only thing to remember is that due to limitations of, or just due to the syntax of JavaScript, you can't have hyphens. And so what it does is that it converts anytime you have a CSS style name that has a hyphen in it, you have to convert it to what's called camel case. So camel case is when you have, so for example, here would be background color, right? And so if you looked at that in camel, if you set that as camel case, it would be like this, background color, right? So you kind of uppercase the first letter of the hyphenated word. So we would change this from background color, right? And you saw there was a little bit of delay in loading the screen, so it actually didn't execute the JavaScript right away, so you could see it change. You can kind of see it change, like quickly flash there when you refresh it sometimes. All right, so that is how you can change the inline style attribute, right? The next thing on our list was set attribute and get attribute, right? And so set attribute and get attribute changes the attributes of the element itself. So in this case, we don't have a lot of attributes defined on this div right now. We only have an ID. All right, so let's make an image element that will have a image attribute, right? So we'll have an image, and then we'll put the image URL in there. And so we have to go get an image. So it's October when I'm recording this. So let's get a pumpkin image. Here's a pretty, let's go to the Wikipedia page. They have, they're pretty, they're happy with you linking to their images, right? So let's get the URL to their image. and it is, here's the URL. So if you went to this URL, right, there's the pumpkin image. It's very large, but that's okay. And so we would put that in here, right? And let's just add a little style where we set the width to be like 400 pixels total. Okay. Oh, sorry. This should be SRC, right? That's how you link to an image. An image tag, you add SRC. And there's our pumpkin image. All right, so now that we have the image tag, right, we should give it an ID. So we'll have my image or something like that. And so now we wanted to try to get one of the attributes, right? So if we look at this list here, you can say set attribute and get attribute. So let's try to get the attribute of this image link, right? So that's SRC. And so if we did, we need to find it again, right? Because we're not working with our div anymore, we're working with our image element. So we'll say get element by ID. Instead of that, we're saying my image, and we're going to change the variable names because we don't want to overwrite our div element. I'm going to say, let's call it my image tag, right? Image, my image. All right, so now we have this my image. And if you think about getting an attribute, it's going to return the value of the attribute. So you'd have to do something with it, right? So let's just console log it. So we can say console.log myImage.get. We want to get attribute, right? Get attribute. And then inside of here, you'd say, what do you want to get? What piece of this attribute do you want to get? And we want to get the SRC attribute, right? So in our document, we have our image, we have our SRC. We also have style and ID, but we're interested in SRC. So if this works, right, we should be console logging the SRC of that pumpkin image. So if we look in our console, we can see, yep, so there is the SRC, the source of that image, right? And so now you can start thinking, well, I can get attributes, right? But I can also set them too, right? And so you would use this get attribute, right, if you wanted to do some modification to an element, but you need to know before you did that modification something about it, right? So a piece of the element had some data in it. Maybe you wanted to check if the image link is a Wikipedia image link or something else, right? Before you do something else specific to it. So you can use this get attribute to get information about elements that's on the page. But of course, you want to also, you can set the attribute, right? And so set attribute is similar to get attribute, except now you say the name of the attribute you want to set and then the value, right? So instead of saying, so say you want to actually change the attribute, the SRC attribute of the image to something else. You can do that using the, instead of setting it, you can use the or instead of getting it, you can use the set attribute. So of course we need one more image of something here. Let's get a different image on the page here. Here is a giant pumpkin. Let's do that. And so we need the URL to this giant pumpkin. Here is the URL to this giant pumpkin. And what we want to do is now, instead of setting it, comment this out, we can say, okay, my image dot set attribute. And inside of these parentheses, you get to say, okay, well, what attribute are you trying to set? And we're trying to set the SRC. And then what are you setting it to? And we're setting it to this new URL of this big pumpkin image. So if we look at the page now, it automatically, it runs that script as soon as the page loads, right? So if we reload it, we might see it change, right? So we can see it as it is kind of loading that new image and it switches over, right? So this seems pretty kind of fundamental stuff, but you can use these to do really kind of elaborate things, right? So changing images, switching out stuff like that, making things change dynamically. If you combine with other stuff, it becomes really powerful, right? All right, so that was the get and set attribute. We also have the class list, add, remove, toggle. And so these class lists let you modify the things that are in the class of the HTML element, right? So if you look at the way um, our current elements are, none of them have any classes defined, right? So if it had classes defined, it'd look like this. If I had a class called pumpkin pick, if this thing had two classes, it would have another class name here, etc. Right? So you can have many infinite number of class names assigned to a certain element, right? And so what we want to do is you can modify this list of things. This is kind of like an array or a list of classes. And so, of course, classes are tied to CSS rules. And so by changing what class is being included in this CSS list, you can change how that element is displayed, and therefore you can change kind of interaction behaviors and change the way things work dynamically, right? So of course, to have classes work, you have to have a class defined, right? So let's go up here into our head here and add a style attribute. So we're going to go add a style attribute in in the head of the document, and we're just going to add a new class. So let's add a class called we'll add a class called thumbnail, and that will make the image width to be very small, like 20 pixels. And so if we had that class, probably want to get rid of the style element though. So we'll get rid of the style element on the image. And we'll say all images to begin with should have a width of 400 pixels. And then this thumbnail class will make the image 20 pixels wide, right? So we still have this, oh, we kind of had it inadvertently made this glitch logo very large because that's also an image. So we'll say my image here. Instead of all images, we'll just say that one image that we have defined should be 400 pixels. All right, so we're back to this size again, right? And so now we define a new class called thumbnail, which will make the style of that, whatever you apply to, the width of it down to 20 pixels. And so what you can do, right, is now that you have this my image pointer, you could say my image dot class, my image dot class list, class list, and you can say you can add and you can remove and you can toggle. And so we're going to add a new class called, or this class we just invented called thumbnail. All right, so if we add this thumbnail using class list.add and we pass the thumbnail into it, when the page loads, it should automatically add that class and we should see a smaller image, but let's see what happens. So it's not smaller. So if we inspect the ID though, if we inspect the element, we can see that the class was added, right? So there's the thumbnail class. And then we can see over here in our rule set that it looks like the ID tag is rule of width is taking precedent over the thumbnail class that we added. It's width there. So let's see what would happen if we change the CSS rule to override that, right? So we can always add important, like we learned. Important. And so that basically is saying apply this class, if you have conflicting rules, value this one over any of the other ones. And so let's see if that did it right. Yeah, so it added that thumbnail class to it and it made it very small, right? Because it's set the width to 20 pixels. So that adds an arbitrary class to it, right? So you can imagine you could also say, okay, well, then after you add it, I want you to remove it. And of course, you'd see it just back to normal, right? Because it added and then it removed it. You can kind of see a fragment of the class that's still here. This class attribute was created and then modified to be empty, so it's still there though. And then there's also this toggle. So you could toggle them on and off. So you could say class with toggle, and that would toggle it on or off. Right, so it toggled it on, then it toggled it off. Or it was on, then it toggled it off, and then toggled it back, or toggled it off, back on, and then toggled back off again, right? So just the opposite. It's like a binary, back and forth, whichever you want it to do. Okay, so those are the main kind of class things and style things you can do, and attribute things you can do with a this element, modifying the element. The other thing you can do, this is really important, is add an event listener. And so an event listener is basically listening for any sort of event that the user does on the web page or event that happens on the web page. And so any sort of interaction you do with the web page creates an internal event, and that internal event has lots of data behind it. If you click on the page, that's an event, right? And that event has metadata about it. Where did you click? Were you holding a different key when you clicked that button, when you clicked in that area? If you pressed a keyboard button, what key did you press? All that kind of metadata associated with the event is stored in there, and you have lots of events that can happen when you interact with a web page. So if you wanted to write an event listener that listened to a specific event, you just have to know what the name of that event is, and then work with the data to do a certain action on that event. But for all these cases, you still have to get a pointer, like we've been doing, to the element that you want to add an event listener to. So if you, for example, wanted to add a new button here, so we're going to add a button here underneath our pumpkin image, and we'll give this button an ID called my button, and we'll say something like toggle size, right? Oh, sorry. So if we add this, I'll do that again. So if we add a new button to this page, right, we'll give an ID of my button, and then inside of here is just the text that we're going to use for the button label, and that's just says toggle size. So if we look at this button, or our button there it is. It's toggle size. You click on it, it doesn't do anything because there's no events bound to it or attached to it or listening to it. And so what we can do is add an event to it. And so, like everything we've done so far, we need to make a pointer to that that element. So we'll say my button, and we'll say document get element by ID, and then the ID is my button, right? And so once you have the pointer, you can add an event listener to it. And the thing about event listeners is that you have to tell what type of event you're listening for. So if we say my button, add event listener, add event listener. And then inside these parentheses, you have to give it two parameters. You have to say what event do you want to listen to. So we want to listen to the click event, and that's just a keyword, click. And then the second thing you have to do is what do you want to do when this event is triggered. And if you think about programming languages and JavaScript, when you say do something, that basically means what function do you want to invoke? What action do you want to do? And so a function is just basically a way of doing something, an action, right? So you could say function, and then here's the function I want you to do. And so inside of these, this is like a reserved word. This is a special word function, and then inside these parentheses are the parameters passed into that function, and then these curly brackets mean here's the code that comprises of the function. And so when you're working with event listeners, it always passes the event variable to it. And so this is kind of like the template that you would reuse over and over for events if you were going to be adding event listeners. First thing is the event you want to listen for, and the second thing is the function you want to happen when you evoke that event. And then this event keyword or the variable is just a variable that represents the metadata about that event, right? So let's see if our button works. So we'll say console.log and we'll say clicked button. And then we'll also console.log the event of that click button. So if this works, then when you click on the button, it should console log this text click button, and then it should also give us some metadata about that event. So if we go to our console page and click the button, we see that it works, right? And so this is the event data that's being passed to it, right? And so if we look at the event data, we can see that there is a number of things passed to this event option, this event. So things like, what were the X, Y positions of the mouse when it was clicked? What was the offset? What was the path of the hierarchy of the element that was clicked on? This is very important. What was the target? So what was the target of the thing that caused the event, right? So in this case, it's the button, right? There it is, my button. And there's lots of other, what was the timestamp when the event happened, etc. So you have now this event listener, right? That's working and listening for this click event. And so, for example, if we wanted to say like toggle the size of the pumpkin based on this click event, then inside of that function, we'd have to put this CSS toggle code that we know already works, right? So let's go in here and we'll just copy this myimage.class.classlist.toggle, and instead of logging everything, we'll just do that action instead, right? So if we look now, if we click this, it should toggle on and off the thumbnail class that we added, right? So it works, right? And so this is something that you can't do really with regular HTML and CSS, static HTML and CSS. It doesn't really, there's no like built-in native feature that lets you toggle image sizes back and forth, right? So you had to build your own kind of component that does that for you using JavaScript. So this kind of demonstrates these main kind of interactions of existing elements by first locating the element you want to work with and then modifying it in some way or attaching an event to it to do some sort of action based on the event that you assigned to it. So now we kind of have some familiarity about how you go about selecting elements and then modifying their CSS attributes and their other HTML attributes. So we can kind of do another example of this a little bit more practical. So say, for example, we wanted to add some sort of like pop-up modal for our site that kind of gives some credit, right? Some about information about who created the page, contact information, etc., stuff like that. So we could kind of think about how that pop-up modal would function, right? Because it's going to pop up on the screen, and then you click the X or something to close it out. And so if you think about how you do that in HTML and CSS, there's really no ways of triggering that sort of dynamic kind of change of view. And so you have to rely on CSS or on JavaScript to do that. So we're going to try adding a modal to our near-time site. And we're going to use an existing library, CSS library, Bulma, that we've used before to do this because it comes built in with a bunch of components already ready to go. And we saw this already by using the navbar component. So you just kind of plop in a navbar and it's pretty much ready to be used. So they also have a modal component. And so the modal component looks something like this, right? Say it's like an all-over window that pops up and then kind of takes the attention from the page. And you can have different types of modals even very verbose title text modals. So you see a big warning here. It says BOMO does not include any JavaScript interaction. You will have to implement the class toggle yourself, right? So they're just providing the HTML and CSS, but they're saying, just because you have the HTML and CSS doesn't mean you can display this in the way that you would want to, right? You have to add your own kind of way of triggering this modal on and off, right? So let's try doing this ourselves. So let's just try to implement the modal first to see how it looks, and then we'll go from there. So I'm just going to remix this existing New York Times site. And so the first thing we have to do, right, is add the Bulma library into the page and add its CSS library, add its CSS files to our file, to our project. So I'm gonna add a file, upload a file, and I'm just gonna go navigate and find my Bulma CSS file. All right, so it's uploaded there, and I'm just going to rename it to live underneath the public directory, like that. So now it's there with our other CSS stuff. And then I'm going to go to our index page, our home page, and I'm going to add it in to our CSS that's being included, bulma.css. All right, so now it's included in our page. So if we go to our home page, for example, which we're on here, we take a look at it. There it is, right? And so let's copy the CSS HTML that they have set up for an example modal and put it in our page and see what it looks like. We'll just throw it in here at the bottom. Let's take a look. All right, so we have to understand their CSS, right, and how it works. So let's look at the documentation here. It says to activate the modal, just add the isActive modifier on the modal container. You might also want to add isClipped modifier to contain the elements, usually HTML, to stop overflow. So it's saying we have to add this isActive class to the modal container class. So let's see if that works. Right. All right, so something happened. Here's a little X up here in the corner. Doesn't really do anything. So let's add some other content here. Or something like this. Maybe we'd add like a P tag with a bunch more text, right? Talking about the project. Let's see how that looks. So it's there, but you can't see it, right? Because it's black on black. So we could add a class here to say about project div or container. Go to our CSS, add that to ours. We'll say background color should be white. Let's inspect this here. Oh, it was refreshing. Yeah, all right. So it kind of works, right? It's not maybe the best. Let's add some padding to EM. Right, and you can make this much more elaborate and aesthetically pleasing, right? But the basic idea is here, right? So we have a modal that's popped up. The problem is it's always on or it's always off because the CSS controls if it's being displayed or not. And if we have that CSS either and hard-coded as on or off, then it's going to be hard-coded on or off, right? And this doesn't work either. So we need a way to toggle that CSS and basically toggle that CSS class, right? So if we look at our HTML again, we have this div with this, the thing that needs to turn on and off is active, right? And so we just need a way to toggle that. So we could have a link here in the footer or something, or in the header. Of course, maybe you probably put this in the nav bar at the top, right? So we won't go through all of that again, but we'll just put this up here, and we'll say something like about page. And so here's where you kind of have to think about how you want this to work, right? So this should probably be, if you're going to add a event to something, you can add an event to anything. It just kind of makes sense. You would add an event to either a button, right? If you're a clickable event, to a button, or a link, because those are the things that you click in HTML. The problem with adding it to a link is that a links navigate somewhere, right? So if you you add it to a link, then it's going to expect it to navigate somewhere, right? Or whereas a button just click, 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 and doesn't do anything. It doesn't matter if it's not hooked up to anywhere. There's no native kind of experience of it's supposed to be a navigational link like an a link is. But say, for example, you want all your other header elements are all a links, so you want to use a link in the header. So what we can do is use a link still, but in the href, I'm just going to put it to this uh, pound sign, number sign, octothorpe symbol here. And that will just mean navigate to the top of the page. And there's also a way to like prevent that from even working as well, as we'll take a look at that. So now we have this about link, right? No, it's there, and we just need to give it an ID so we can target it, right? So we'll call this about link. And so if we turn off the modal, right, we'll remove is active from it, so it's not always on. Then at the bottom of our page here, we can add our own new JavaScript, right? And so in our JavaScript, we can, first thing we need to do is find a pointer to that a link, right? So we'll find the element. So we'll say var about link equals, maybe we'll do camel case, about link equals document get element by ID, and then the ID is about link. And then also let's get the pointer to the modal too, right? So the modal here is here, it doesn't have an ID yet, so we'll add a class or add an ID called about modal. And so now we can make a variable or pointer or reference to the about modal. Right? And again, these are just variables. You call them whatever you want. It could be anything. It just, if this was X and this was Y, that would be a little confusing about what they were. So name your variables in a way that makes sense and helps you remember what they do. So now we have basically what we need, right? We have a pointer to the about link open and a pointer to the modal. And there's a couple other things, but we'll get to those next. But basically, when we want to click the about link, we want to toggle the class is active on, right? Or we want to add it to the modal. So we need an event listener, right? So we can say add event listen, right? And the first thing is what event you want to listen to. So we'll say click. And then the second one is what do we want to do when you click on that, right? So you have to pass it a function that looks like this. And inside of the thing you pass, you usually pass the event. And then inside these curly brackets is where you put your code that you want to happen, right? And so basically, when you click on the thing, you want to toggle that modal is active on or off, right? So we already have the modal defined here. So we could say about modal class list toggle. and then the class you want to toggle, right? So we know the class name is active. And so let's see if that works. Yeah, right. So now when you click about, it toggles it on. Um, and you also notice if you can see in the search bar or the URL bar, when I clicked on it, it added the /# sign, number sign. So it is navigating somewhere, right? And so you can actually stop that from doing that if you control the event. So you can actually do this. You can say about link, or no, you can say event, right? We pass the event. And you can say event prevent default. And so basically this just tells the browser to stop the default action of the event. And the default action of the event would be to navigate somewhere, right? And so if we do that, we have no pound sign there. Here, we refresh. If we click this about sign, it should not add a pound sign. So you see it didn't add it there, right? So that's one way of getting around that. And A-links have to have a href, attribute. So you can leave that number sign in there, but you can also prevent it from actually doing anything. And so that's a little bit of a nice feature. So we want to, our problem now is that you can't close this modal, right? Once it's open, it's open. So we want to do the same thing with maybe this X, right? So we'll add let's look at the code for the X here. So we have this button modal close. So what we could do is add an ID to that guy, right? And say about close and make a pointer to them. And basically we can just duplicate this little code block, right? And just do the same thing, but with the about close. And we don't need to prevent the default because it's not a link. The default action is to do nothing. It's a button, so it doesn't matter. So we have this about modal, and we'll toggle it again, right? So let's see if it works. So open, it's here, and then close. I'm clicking the X in the top corner, and it closes it. All right, so that's good. You might want to say like, well, I've seen other functionality where you just kind of click somewhere outside the modal and it closes. So let's see if we can do that too. So we have this class here called modal background. That's probably that big black section. And so we could probably add an ID to that, right? We'll call it about modal background. And we'll do the same thing here. About background. Add in that ID instead. And make another link here, another click event here for that about background. And it's a div, so it doesn't have any default behavior when it's clicked, so we don't need to prevent defaults. So hopefully if we click here, we click in here, nothing happens, but then we click here and it closes, right? That's a little bit nicer behavior, right? All right, so this looks pretty good. The other thing you might want to add is like the keyboard event, right? So sometimes you are probably pretty common to hit escape keys when you see this kind of pop-up modal behavior, and you would expect it to close the modal if you hit escape key, right? So of course that doesn't work because it's not set up to work. So we need to add a new event to this page. So when we press escape, if the modal is open, then we want to close it. And so what we can do is first we need a couple things, right? We need to know what event to add, where to add it, and then um, what to do. What kind of criteria do we need to check, right? So there is a list of events. All right, JavaScript event list, event references, and so these are the kind of most commonly used event types, right? So we already know the click event type. But there's a lot of different types of events that can happen too, right? That I mentioned earlier. So there's lots of uh, resource kind of events. So like you can actually add an event to an image that if the image fails to load, you can do something. So like broken images can actually be gracefully handled somehow. Having some alternative to an image that's broken, the URL doesn't resolve, or the image was taken down, or something like that. Focus events, so if something is focused on, right? So an input box is clicked on, or a button is clicked on, etc. Um, CSS animation stuff, you can actually loop into those animation events and do some JavaScript based on them. Forms, so if you're submitting a form, uh, inputs, you can actually, before a page is printed out physically, you can do something. So some view events, like if there's a resize event, or if someone's scrolling in the page like this. Um, Clipboard events, so someone copy and paste. And then here's probably where we want to look into, right? So keyboard events. So there's key down, key press, and then key up. And so if you think about the anatomy of your keyboard, when you press the keyboard button, it's a key down. When you release the key, that's a different event. That's a key up. And then there's a generic key press where it's just if you just press a key, it is, it doesn't break the key down versus the key up. It's just the down and up. And so you might think that's kind of over the top, but it is interesting because like if you do a key down and you hold it, it's repeating, right? So there's many key down. It's like a key down event that repeats, and a key up you might only want it to do, stop that or something like that. So you do have these very fine-grained controls over these events, like the key press and the key up and down. So I think we just need the key press event really. We don't really care if it's to keep track of the down and up in this case. We just care that they press the escape key. And so they have an event example here. And so they have they're adding the event listener to just the document itself. And then they have a function here called log key. And so, they define their function and then they pass it here, but we've been writing it in line. It's the same thing. So we can just copy this, right? Document.add event listener. And let's modify it so that we can actually see when we press these keys what happens. So we'll console log something, right? So we have key press adding this to the document, and we'll add our function, and we'll have an event, and then we have our curly brackets that the code goes into, right? And so we want to know, we need to check, right? Because if I press the space bar, I don't want the modal to close, we only want to close on the escape key. We could make it so that any key press closes it, but the desired behavior, you might come in and add a little email contact form in that about page, right? So you don't want, as soon as someone starts typing their email address, for it to close, right? So we need to know how we could check to see if this event that's happening corresponds to the right key that we want our event to take place on. So what you can always do is console log the event and see what kind of properties you have to work with. So now if I open up the inspect elements and I go to the console tag, so whenever I press a key, now there's a keyboard event, right? And so you can see there is a key code, key D, a key D, I press the D key. So let's try pressing the escape key and see what it says. Oops, I have to be focused on the web page. Escape key. Oh, interesting. It's not capturing the escape key. Let's try the key down event and see if it does the same thing. Huh. So the key press event was not capturing the escape key. but the key down event did for some reason. You have to look into see there might be some system behavior why the key press key is not triggered on the escape key versus the key down event. But we'll just go with that. The key down event does capture the key press for escape, and it has this code escape and key escape. So what we can do is test this, right? So I always like to print out, what we want to test. So we know that if this is an object of values, and so it has these different values. One of them is called code. And so what we could do is we could check to see if this code is what we think it's going to be. And so we're actually going to use this key code 27 because that's a little bit more standardized. So you can think about across different browsers. You maybe want to test this in different browsers to see if the same key code is the same across browsers for as far as this code property. But I know that this key code is pretty standardized across all browsers. So I'm going to use this key code. So if I wanted to print the key code instead of just the whole thing, I would say events.keycode, because the key code is a property of the event object. So if I press escape now, I see 27 being repeated, right? And other keys have other values, right? So what we can do is check to see if we are actually pressing the escape key and only do something if there's an escape key being pressed, not any other key. So this is called an if statement, right? And we've done this a little bit with our templates, but if we have a if statement, we say if, and then inside the parentheses, we say what we want to test. So we want to test key code, and then how do we want to test it? And we say we want it to be equal to 27. And this is a number, so it's not in quotations, it's a real number. And then we have curly brackets to say, okay, do this code if this if statement is true. And so we'll put this code that we want it to do inside of the if statement. And still the code is just printing to the console, right? So if I press any other key, I'm typing any other key here, but as soon as I hit escape key, then it console logs it. So I know it's only doing it if it's being, the escape key is being pressed here. So the last thing we can do, right, is not display, or we want to toggle the modal window, right? So let's just throw this in here and see how it works. Instead of printing out the key code, we'll just toggle the is active, right? So if we have this open and we hit escape, it works, right? I'd imagine though if it's open and if it's not open and we hit escape, then it opens it, right? Which is maybe not our desired behavior, right? We don't want every time someone hitting escape key, like it pops up this random modal. Like, why would that do? Why? That's unexpected behavior, right? So we want to close the window if it's open, but not open the window if it's already closed. If that makes sense. So we have to add another check in here somehow. We have to be able to tell as if the modal window is already being displayed or not. And so we know that the modal window is displayed if the class is active is added to the modal already. So if it already has the class is active, then we know it's open, right? And so what we can do is we can actually test this. So we can test this by, we'll just console log it for now, just to test it. But we can say about modal, and we'll say class list, and we'll say contains. And inside the parentheses, you test what do you want to test to see if the class list contains. And we want to test if the is active class is already added to the class list. And so we should see the result of this test in our console log when we press escape, right? So let's try it. Right, so when it is closed, so is active is not on there, and I hit escape, the value of that contains is active is false, right? And when it's open, there isn't is active in the class list, so the value of that contains is true. So knowing this, we could actually test it. We could actually test for that and only do the toggle if it is not there, right? Or if it is there, I'm sorry. So if it is there, then toggle it off. If it's not there, then do nothing, right? So we know that this little bit of code here either says true or false based on if the is active is added to there or not. So we can write another if statement and say if that little code is equal to false, right? Or sorry, it's equal to true. Getting things mixed up in my head, right? So if it is in the list of classes, so that's true, then we want to toggle it. If it's not there, then this code will never run. It will just skip past it, right? So we have two nested if statements here, right? So we check if the key code is 27 first, so they are pressing 27, which is the escape key. And then we're testing to see if the class list is active. So it's already available, it's already open. And if that both of those things are true, then it will get to this code and execute it, right? So let's give it a test to see if it works. So I'm pressing escape key now, nothing's happening. I have the about open, and I'm going to press escape key, and it closes. Right. So it's kind of a lot of work just for a very simple feature, but it kind of illustrates why it's JavaScript's important to add this interactivity to a web page, right? Because there's no way of doing this without having some sort of JavaScript hooks. And there's no native thing built in about toggling modals on and off, right? So you actually have to build it from scratch to do this certain things. But this is very similar to a lot of things you'd be doing using event listeners. You'd be adding new classes to elements and removing them based on your JavaScript criteria, right? And so this is kind of a good illustration of doing that that basic usage of JavaScript modifying the CSS. So let's do one more example. Let's head back to the list of event possibilities. And so there's a number of events, right, that we looked at. One was a scroll event that I think in class that a lot of folks were interested in, basically having certain effects or kind of changes in styles on the page based on the scroll action, right? So as you scroll, things change and different things come into view, etc., right? So let's try to do like a simple version of that just to see how difficult it is or how to get started. So I'm going to look at the scroll documentation, and basically there's a little example they have where they add an event listener. This time they're adding it to the window, right? Usually we were adding it to a specific div or button or a link, or we're adding it to the document for the key down. But for the scroll, we're adding it to the window, which kind of makes sense if you think about, like, you scroll on the window, you type in the document, you click on a button, right? So this window is always there. It's a reserved word. It's always going to be there, and it has a scroll. So let's just get, and then they kind of demonstrate how they get this position of the scroll with this window.scroll y, right? So let's just see if we can replicate this functionality in our page. So let's go back to our pumpkin appreciation site that we created here, and we will try to modify it so that it's very large, like long, and then we'll see if we can get the scroll to work, just to wake up. All right, so let's make the page much longer. And so what we could do is we could actually just add a to the body. We could just normally your page would be a certain height because you have content in it, but we're just going to kind of artificially make it larger by saying it should have a min height. The body of the page should have a min height of let's just say like 10,000 pixels, or maybe 10,000 pixels. Let's see how big that is. See if that's too much or not. So if we look at it now, it's quite a tall page, right? Maybe it's too tall. Let's do 5,000. So it's still quite a tall page. All right, so what we want to do is try to implement that event listener, that scroll event listener. So I'm going to go back to my scripts here that I have already at the bottom of the page. And I'm just going to add that window event listener, add window.add event listener scroll, and then here's our function, right? They call their event E, but we'll just call it event. And then it has a closed parentheses, right? And here's the where you put the code that you want to trigger. And then this example, they were saying they were getting access to the Windows height by doing scroll.y or window.scroll.y. So let's just console log that. Window.scroll.y. So if this works, then we should see something happen when we scroll in our console window, right? So let's look at our console window and scroll. Right, yeah, so you can see numbers are ticking up, right? So this is like an offset of pixels, right? So kind of gets towards the end, it's close to 5,000, right? There's probably a lot of, the scroll position might not actually be exactly at 5,000. It might be, because there's more to scroll that's in view and you're not scrolling. So we know that it works. We have this number, this integer, this whole number that as we scroll up and down, it's smaller at the top and then larger and larger at the bottom. So we could think about like maybe testing for that, right? And doing something when there's a certain number is reached or thresholds reached, right? So we could say maybe when it gets to the end, some sort of animation happens or something comes into the view, right? So let's find the two parts of this, right, are as we did the modal, you have to have the HTML and CSS set up, and then you have the JavaScript that triggers it. So let's get something we can throw into the page to trigger at the end there. Let's stick with our current theme. I'm searching for transparent PNG here. This looks like a pretty good one, right? So we have this image here. I'm gonna save it. And then I'm going to, I'm just going to upload it to the root of the directory. You probably want to put this into the assets folder, but I'm just going to upload it for just this one because we're only going to have one. Okay, so I put it up, it put in the assets already. And so if I wanted to reference this, this is this huge long URL that I'd have to use, right? All right, so I have this added to my assets, so I'll try to include it at the bottom of the page. Let's see how it looks. This is not a transparent PNG. This is a PNG with a checkerboard background. So we've been misled here. Let's find a real transparent one. All right, these look better. All right, so this is actually transparent. There's no checkerboard background, which that's how it looks in Photoshop, so it tricked me there. So we'll save this as choose that pumpkin, save that. We'll do that again, upload. All right, so there is our image. Let's add that to our page instead of the one we had. Let's see how it looks. All right, So it's very large and it's at the top of the page. So let's put it at the bottom of the page and make it much smaller so we can set the CSS right. We'll give it an ID of and so we'll give it a size, right, a width, make it pretty small. We'll give it a position. Well, actually, let's just do this in the browser because it's easier to adjust it, right? All right, so we have our pumpkin nicely resized here. And we just want to play around with the CSS styles to know what styles to give it in our CSS style block. So we're going to set the positioning to, we'll set it to fixed. So it'll be like stuck at a certain point on the page. And then we can set the bottom to 0. So it will always be at the bottom of the page, right? And if we know that the height of it is a certain size, right? So it is currently 200 by 177. We can say, okay, well the bottom should be not 0, but if as we go down, it kind of hides off the page, right? So if we drop that down to 177, should be pretty much invisible from the page. It's like hidden off screen, regardless of where you are, right? So let's add that to our rules here for the pumpkin image. So if we have these now, so it's like in position, right? And so what we could do is we could check that scroll width, and when it gets to a certain position in the scroll width, then change the bottom value to 0, and it kind of would pop up, right? So let's look at that code we could do here. So we already have this add event listener scroll, so it's checking for this position on the page, right? So let's look at this again. So when we get down to the bottom of the page, it's 4,600-ish. So we could say like when you get to, let's say like 4,400, then change it so the pumpkin pops into view. So what we need to do is we need to check that, right? So if we would just write an if statement like we did before. We'd say if scroll is greater than or equal to 4,400, 4,400, and this is just a whole number, right? Then do whatever we want it to do, right? And we could check this too, right? So if we move the console log into that block, just to make sure that it only starts printing once we get to a certain area, right? Yeah, so once we get at the end, it's there. So what we can do now is we need to figure out how to make that pumpkin appear, right? And so here's kind of like we have to think about. So if you add code inside of this block here, it will happen every single time there's a scroll event, right? And so you want to limit the amount of activity or things you do in that block, because the more you have in there, then that's a lot of code running for every little scroll, right? So what we can do is we can do our define our pointer to the pumpkin image first, right? So we have our pumpkin image called pumpkin image. So let's do our variable to point to it outside of that block of code, right? So outside of this block. So we'll say var pumpkin pop-up equals document get element by ID, and it's the pumpkin image. So now we have a pointer to that, and that would be available to us in here. And so we can say, okay, well, when it gets to that point, then we can say, okay, well, pumpkin pop-up do style, right? Because we know that we have that style property available to us, and then whatever is here is the CSS property. And so we could say bottom is set to 0. So if it gets to this point and this triggers, and the pumpkin pop-up style should change from that negative 177 pixels to 0, and so it should pop up. Let's see if it works. So if we scroll, okay, so it says cannot read property style of null. So that's basically saying, and then it gives you a little link to where it's happening. So it's happening on this part that we're trying to work on, right? So we either did two things wrong. Either we did not use the right ID selector, or we did something else that we did not get a real pointer to that pumpkin image, right? So let's double check everything. So the ID is called pumpkin image. This is our code that we did, element, get element by ID. So you can always run code in the console. You can actually run this in the console here and see if it comes back with anything. So it does come back with stat. So let's double check our variable names. Pumpkin pop-up, style. So let's go back to our notes to see if that's how it should be used. So this is our notes here. Yeah, so this element.style.left is the example we did. So we did .style, element.style.bottom. So that should work. Oh, you know what we did here? So this is thinking about it more, so what we did here is we have our image pumpkin here defined. We put that below our JavaScript that we're working on. So here's our JavaScript, and then here's that image. So when this JavaScript is run, this image tag has not been rendered yet, and so it's not available to be used. So that's one of the things we talked about in the very beginning that I've done accidentally fell into that trap. So we're going to put the image element before our script tag so it actually exists by the time the script runs, right? Okay, so now that we have it in the right place, if we scroll to a certain point, it should pop up, right? And then it's there permanently. So there's a couple things not great about this is that it just jumps into existence immediately. So remember we did last time we did some transitions, right? So we could add a transition to this pumpkin so that uh, only it takes longer to actually transition from that bottom value from negative 177 to 0. So we could set the transition for the property of bottom, and then we could set the transition duration to something like you know 2 seconds or something like that, right? So I'll copy that and put it into our pumpkin style. So now it should transition, instead of just immediately switching, it would transition to that. Oh, wow. Let's try it again. Very, not spooky, but something. All right, so the only other thing is that we probably wanted to maybe hide if we scroll back up again. Um, so what we can do is put another if statement here, right? And say if the scroll width is less than, we'll say 400, 300, 4,300 pixels, then we get rid of the logs. Then set the bottom to negative 177 pixels, right? And so now as soon as we go from whole numbers like 0, which is means just 0 everything, to actual value like a unit measurement, like, and this is negative pixels, we have to wrap this in quotation marks because now it's like a specific value. It's not really a number, it's like a value with a unit attached to it. So it has to be stored as a string there. All right, so let's see if it works. We scroll down, there he is, comes into view, and then if we scroll up, it kind of hides, peeks away, right? And so you can do a lot of modifications to this. You could change the easing effect so it kind of like quickly comes into view or more slowly or waits a second or something like that. And then, you might want to do some other checks to see if you're, way up here, then don't even bother with the pumpkin setting the style of it, etc. But yeah, that's a good start. So for using these CSS properties and using them with JavaScript, the key is right to you want to locate the element using this get element, or there's other element identifiers or locators like get by class or get by tag name, etc. And then you can attach anything you want to it, right? You can attach event listeners, you can add modify the styles, modify the attributes, etc. But this is kind of like the very basic building blocks that you can do to start building up and doing very complicated kind of interactions with your page that's not available with CSS or vanilla HTML and CSS. So thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later. Thanks. Bye.